Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Disaster Recovery in the Cloud, from Catastrophe to Cloud Ready in half a webinar. So my name is James Watts and I'm here today with Mark Thomas, who's going to be delivering a short presentation on disaster recovery and giving us a very quick demo recovery. So first off, Mark, over to you. Can you kick off the recovery?
Hi there everyone, welcome to the webinar. I hope everyone can see the screen. So what I'm going to start this webinar off by doing is to set the position of how we're going to recover a virtual machine, and then while we talk, hopefully we'll be able to recover that virtual machine before the end of the discussion. So if I just come out of the presentation shortly, we'll just set the scene. So what we have for this particular demo is we're demoing a hybrid solution. Now for a hybrid solution, we have a client who has a physical or even a virtual environment that's replicating into our virtual data centers. I've just brought up a vSphere client here. Within this environment, we can see there's a vApp called MailSphere Testing. This is the vApp that we want to protect at this moment in time. For this particular demo, we're using our Zerto protection features. We'll be talking about that later on in the webinar, but basically I just wanted to show you that there's two virtual machines within this particular vApp, and if we look at one of these virtual machines, you can see that it has actually Exchange installed on it, it has an OS, and it should be representative of any virtual machine that a client may have. If I then quickly switch the interface over to here, what I'll show you is the recovery data center. So in this particular scenario, we have a client 1 data center, and that represents the recovery data center for this particular demo. Within this particular data center, there are already two vApps already live, but as we can see, there are no vApps relevant to the service that we're about to protect, and hopefully by the end of this webinar we will find that those virtual machines have been started in the data center. So to represent the failure, what I'm actually going to do is actually just power off this virtual machine as if it was a typical failure scenario. Just hard power off, no shutdown, which obviously kills the machine. At this point in time, with a hybrid solution, from the interface, clients can actually initiate their own failover if they actually want. As a fully managed service, we also have the ability to initiate it from our side if it was a full site failure. From the interface, all we need to do is click on the failover button here. As you can see, there is a live failover and a test failover. We're actually going to do a test failover in this particular scenario because it just leaves the source machines up and running. But in the event of a failure, we'd actually do the live. So if I click on the failover button, what it allows us to do is just choose a recovery point, and there's more options to this than just the latest recovery point, but we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on within the webinar. So I'll just click next and click failover, and what will happen now is we'll start to see the failover start, and in the background what we should actually start to see is the process start taking place. So as you can see, things are taking place in the destination data center.
Perfect. Okay, so now we've got the recovery kicking off. I'll cover a couple of quick bits of housekeeping first. So today's webinar is scheduled to take place for 20 minutes. We will have some time at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions during the course of the webinar, pop them into the box. We'll try and get through as many as we can at the end. So, Mark, to start with, a first quick question: why is disaster recovery so well suited to cloud computing?
Well, yes, James. Obviously, I think everyone understands the cost benefits of cloud computing, and I don't think it's any different for DR. In fact, it's probably more relevant to DR than maybe production systems. The slide that we have on the screen at the moment shows a kind of traditional consumption model against an infrastructure service or cloud model. Obviously, on the left-hand side, with any kind of infrastructure spend, there's normally a purchase cycle, and there's a point where you are underutilizing that particular infrastructure, and then points where you may be actually overutilizing that infrastructure as well, which leads to either overspend or dissatisfaction from the particular client business. Obviously for DR, this can be exaggerated considering you may not be actually utilizing that infrastructure in the same way. Obviously, as we look with infrastructure as a service, because of the way that we can scale and be more tightly aligned to consumption, we can be more cost effective for both DR than we can for traditional solutions. So if we kind of look at the next slide, this kind of highlights the kind of points that we're talking about. On the left-hand side, the traditional disaster recovery scenario, organisations would normally provision an identical set of resources, or at least a set of resources that would allow them to run their infrastructure if they could not recover in their primary site. And unless they are actually utilising that on a daily basis, there's a huge amount of wastage for the vast majority of the time. Not to mention the cost involved with the co-location potentially, or the data centre facilities or anything else like that, which obviously is not necessarily so effective. If we then obviously look on the right-hand side towards how a cloud DR service works, well, the way we'll look at later about how we provision resources allows for clients to have less resource overhead for the times when they don't need it, and at the point that they really require it, i.e. when DR is invoked, that they can actually scale that resource up and then pay a cost associated with it only at the time when they really, really need it.
Got it. Okay, so traditionally, what were the options for disaster recovery?
So traditionally, obviously for both physical and virtual environments, there are quite a few options. Normally, if there's a large set of data, SAN replication was seen as the kind of choice to get from A to B. That's not a problem normally for most businesses, but obviously there is a significant capital outlay for those kind of solutions. There are obviously solutions higher up the stack for virtualization and replication, or even backup and recovery, and obviously at the kind of the high end of the scale, which kind of gives the longest RTOs, RPOs, was just basically backing up their machines and then having a recovery situation where they restore from backups. But most of these had relatively long RTOs and RPOs, and weren't necessarily seen as being satisfactory for most businesses. And so obviously a lot of businesses are trying to improve their DR and trying to get that at a cost point that delivers some value back to their business.
Okay, so you touched upon the cost there, Mark. Can you explain how cloud-based disaster recovery and disaster recovery service is priced, and how that's different?
Sure. So if we look at the slide that just been brought up on the screen at the moment, now we talk about infrastructure service for production systems, and this is still based upon the same methodology for DR as well. If we look at what we're representing here, we have a typical client looking at their source side, so this is their production infrastructure, and we've got 4 VMs here that represent the resource utilization of that infrastructure. What we do is we analyze the actual business requirements for those machines. And obviously, over time, as each of those machines peaks and troughs, there will be an aggregate set of consumption. What we do then is we look at that aggregated set of consumption, and instead of saying that you need to reserve 100% of that resource for the off chance that you may need to recover, we can actually set a lower threshold, which means that you have the ability to recover for testing purposes. And also, generally, when organisations do have disaster recovery scenarios, they don't need to bring back 100% of their servers from day one. So what we do is base that reservation on how much infrastructure needs to be back straight away. But because we're a cloud service provider, we can be very flexible on this. So what we have is the ability to kind of raise or lower that reservation to give a kind of mix and blend between a fixed cost kind of SLA guarantee about what can be recovered day one, and then a pay-as-you-go model above that line. So there are no limits within the environment. It's just that they can change how they kind of get their cost for those particular scenarios where they go above the reservation. So if a client wanted to reserve 100%, they can, but effectively that models a physical environment situation where it's 100% like for like.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So I guess we're about halfway through now. I think it's probably about time to check on the recovery and see how that's getting on.
Okay, so we haven't really been talking for a huge amount of time on, so we'll see how we're progressing. So, but maybe this will highlight obviously the benefits of these types of solutions. So if we actually go back to what's happening within our client at the moment, we can actually track at the moment the failover progress. We can see down here that it's actually saying it's 81%, which is not too bad considering we've only been going for well, not even 10 minutes at the moment, so it's pretty good. If we go and have a look on the the cloud side, we can obviously see that previously there was nothing going on within the virtual data center. But if we give that a refresh now, what we can actually see is that there are now 2 virtual machines within this environment, and we can see that they're representative of the machines that were on the source side, and they're just going through a process at the moment of being started up. And for this particular scenario, there may be some reconfiguration going on as a testing, but again, that's out of the scope of what we're actually doing at the moment for this webinar.
Perfect. Okay, well, we'll check back on that shortly, and hopefully we'll be finishing up and can be completely recovered. So you've mentioned a couple of the different types of replication. Can you give us a quick run-through of the various different methods for data transfer and the options that we're actually using at Data Barracks?
Okay, sure. So we've obviously talked that there are numerous different ways for people to traditionally do DR, and if you look at the kind of options for both for client and for us as a service provider, there are kind of 4 different layers. As discussed, there's the storage or hardware layer. Obviously, all storage vendors have some kind of replication. As discussed, that's normally the most efficient way for getting large amounts of data from A to B and the changes that are required. It's not necessarily the most cost-effective for service providers, but certainly for traditional clients, that's normally one that they would choose. Above that, you get hypervisor level protection, and these are normally creating virtual SANs or virtual asynchronous or block level changes. And what happens there is it kind of takes away the requirement to have similar hardware and allows you to get the same features as you would do, but without that kind of having to have matching infrastructure. And also because they tie in with the particular hypervisor, it allows for a lot quicker RTOs and RPOs than maybe some of the other solutions. Moving up to the 3rd layer, we get to what we call the VM level protection applications, and obviously some listed there. And what these are traditionally are kind of backup and restore of individual virtual machines, and this happens normally on a scheduled basis rather than near-time or real-time replication. So as we kind of scale up, we can kind of get to a different RTO and RPO again, and obviously as you go up the stack, there's a different cost point and a different solution options. And right at the top, we have application level, and there are a number of different things on here as discussed previously. If there's no other way of doing DR, kind of backup and recovery is the option that sits in here. But similarly, things such as Exchange, DAGs, SQL replication, or any of those other kind of application or OS level protection applications sit within that, which can provide particularly small RTOs and RPOs. For us as a provider organisation, we have an offering at each of these levels because we know that obviously every business has a different requirement, and there isn't one single product that actually addresses all of those needs. So we have the storage replication, we have a hypervisor replication, we also have a scheduled VM level replication, and for physical machines, I should also mention, this isn't just talking about virtual recovery to a data center. We can recover physical environments to our virtual data center. And we also have a solution for just doing a VDR solution, which is basically backups and recovers if that was still seen as like valid for a business.
Great, thank you for that. And so I think what would be interesting is if you could explain, I know during our exploratory phase when we were looking at different types of technology and what we would use for our disaster recovery as a service, there were some certain technologies that we discounted and chose not to use. Could you do a quick run through of why that was, and not naming any names, but what the issues were?
Okay, sure. So obviously as a service provider, we have slightly different requirements from an end user customer. Obviously our main focus is around multi-tenancy and being able to securely segregate out our clients. So that poses some challenges to some of the maybe older technologies in this kind of area. And also from a cost perspective, there's a couple of solutions that we don't offer in certain scenarios just in the fact that it doesn't make economic sense. So as an example, for our hybrid solutions, we don't use storage replication. We actually use hypervisor-based replication or above. Why? It keeps the cost down. It means that we don't have to have a huge outlay in infrastructure and many different types of solutions within our data center just to support individual clients. What it also actually means is we can provide pretty tight RTOs and RPOs as well, because we get much tighter integration with our cloud service offering. Obviously, if you go up the scale, some of the VM level backup products, again, aren't kind of geared towards kind of consumer end users for like a cheap way of backing up their virtual machines, which wouldn't necessarily be suited for us. So again, the choice of the products that we selected are all about providing the best RTOs and RPOs and at the right cost point to make this as cost effective as possible.
Perfect. I guess that you started on, I guess, including some of the points there, but could you run through some of the things that businesses need to be aware of? What are the considerations if you want to move to a cloud-based disaster recovery service?
Sure. So I think we've talked about getting the data from A to B, but that's not necessarily the whole story for a disaster recovery solution. So there normally need to be some other considerations as well. I think the one we've got on the slide is access, and obviously that's normally driven by a business's requirements and saying what are you actually protecting yourself from? Are you protecting yourself from a single server failure, or actually protecting yourself from a full site failure? And each of those has a different requirement for a solution setup, but it also might have a requirement for a business to look at how they access their infrastructure. It's all well and good to say that you have users who sit in your office accessing your server infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. If the DR event does occur and you move your servers to a cloud provider, but your site has failed, how do your users actually get access to that data? Because ultimately that's how your business runs normally. Your data might be safe, but if you can't get access to it, then ultimately you still haven't achieved what your ultimate goal was. So implementing solutions such as a VDI solution, remote desktop solution, either prior to DR or as part of your DR service, as we offer for our customers, is kind of vitally important, that not only do we protect your data, but we also give access back to your users at that most critical component and the time.
And secondly, how about the big question that I know people always ask us, which is the bandwidth requirements?
Yeah, so bandwidth is a bit of a tricky one, unfortunately. The answer is it really depends on the client and the amount of data that changes, and ultimately the solution that's chosen. The reason it's so tricky, the answer is that each client, while they might take the same solution, ultimately it's how much data changes and how much data they have to start with, and dictates kind of what that bandwidth figure looks like. Now, as part of some of the services we offer, we do an analysis to try and work out what that kind of figure will look like. But again, the real answer is how much data changes within an individual client's environment. Traditionally, we're seeing probably it's about 10 to 20% of their overall data, but it really depends on how much data changes for an individual client.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And so now I think probably we're about ready to take a look back at the recovery and see how we got on.
Okay, so let me come out of this again and we'll see how we've progressed. So if we now look at our recovery data site, we can actually now see that we have the virtual machines, they've actually finished. If we actually look at the source side, we can actually see that failover actually completed there in 9 minutes, which is not too bad. I think most businesses would accept that a 9-minute recovery for a set of machines is acceptable, certainly better than most businesses' DR plans as it currently stands. Just to prove, obviously, that it's actually working, we've got the virtual machines here. I'll just log on to one of them to show that they are up and running within the environment. Obviously, it's probably going to be the slowest part of the demo. Well, that comes up. Obviously, while we've been talking, you can see that the actual virtual machine's been recovered in the background there. So I know it's was doing some bits while we were looking at it previously. So.
Okay, perfect. In that case, we've got a bit of time now then for a couple of questions. I'll do a quick run through some of the ones we've got. So top of the list, what servers can't be recovered in the cloud?
Well,
so I guess this is about limitations and anything that isn't possible to be included.
Now, I mean, if you do the right capacity planning, then there's really very little that you can't recover into the cloud. Depending on the solution, ultimately it drives the requirements for that disaster recovery. So it's is it a high transactional machine? Is it something that can be taken down? Does it require to be near-time replication, and what are basically the business requirements for that particular system? The only caveats are to make sure that the appropriate resources are allocated on the destination side, based on the fact that we obviously know there's a certain amount of resources required for an individual machine, and there are certain resource limits that may be specified as part of the disaster recovery solution. So as long as it's scoped appropriately, before implementation, then there's really very little that can't be protected. As we talked about, we have solutions that replicate physical machines. So most people say, how do I do DR for a physical machine? Well, we can actually replicate that and get a physical machine to be recovered into our virtual data center. Again, it's all down to the planning and making sure that there's enough thought about the resources required and the particular recovery targets.
Okay, and we've just had, I guess, further to this point, on the same questions of what can be recovered. Can you support HyperV?
We can. So our environment isn't a HyperV environment, as people may have seen, but we can actually provide protection from any kind of virtual environment using some of the technologies that we have, based on the fact that we can treat them as physical machines. And what does that mean? Well, a virtual machine is an OS that just runs on a platform, whether it's physical or virtual. If you treat it as a physical machine, then yes, we can actually recover it into a data center using effectively a P2V process, which converts it to the right technology.
Thank you, Doug. And I think we've got time for one last question. And so this is perhaps slightly technical. You might need to explain this to me. So how do you maintain application consistency?
Okay.
Can you explain application consistency just to start with?
Well, I can try. With all DR solutions, there's the requirement for consistency of data. And consistency of data means if you recover your machine, is that data able to basically start up without any further intervention? So the importance is to get to a point where when your machine boots up, that actually there is no issue with that particular server. So when you look at crash consistent, that's the equivalent of having power pulled out of the machine, and then when you bring that machine up, does it come into recovery mode saying, I've had the unexpected power outage, and does that have an issue with things like SQL Exchange, which may have file locks? Application consistent means basically that the applications within the virtual machine are consistent to a point that they will start without any manual intervention. So the question was, can you provide application consistent DR? Well, yes, you can. It really depends, obviously, on the solution. So in most of the solutions we have, they integrate at an OS level to a point to allow the snapshotting of the OS below the applications to make sure that the data is taken as a whole. That way, when the data is replicated over, we know that there is a consistent point to be able to recover to. And certainly with some of the products, we can actually create flags within the data stream that highlight a particular point, say if an application needs to be caressed or users want to make any particular change at the point, that can say that this is a known point in time. Again, it really depends on the individual the solutions, what that actual feature looks like.
Perfect. Okay. Well, in that case, that actually takes us to time for today. We do have a few questions that we haven't managed to get through to, so I'll make sure we respond to everyone over email. Make sure you will get an answer to each of those. But thank you very much for attending today. We hope this has been useful for you all. Thanks to you, Matt.
Thanks, James.